All right. Hi, Peter. Hi, Joseph. Thank you so much for joining me here today on Vonvo.com. It's a pleasure to have you both to discuss gun control. Today is February 16th, and I just want to go over two things before we got started. The first is that this conversation is being recorded right now, and after the recording's over, I'm going to be posting it to YouTube. Is that okay with both of you?
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
Okay, great. And the next thing I was just going to ask is that here at Vonvo, we want all of our conversations to be both civil and valuable. So we ask that there not be any personal attacks against anyone, and that we have our conversation stay both civil and valuable. Are you guys okay with those rules?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, great. So what I was going to say next is, could we each, for any of our viewers who are listening inside the room, could we have both you, Peter, and Joseph? Peter, you could go first. Could you just give our audience and anyone who watches this video a quick background of yourself and why you're so passionate about this topic? And then, Joseph, you could do the same.
I currently live in Canada, but I'm still a U.S. citizen registered to vote, and the rest of my living in Canada has to do more with my work than anything else. Growing up on the south side of Chicago, in fact, not the house that I grew up in is not far from the home that Obama lives in today. It was an interesting experience, and by the time I was about 25, I had known more people who had been victims of firearm violence than I did of any other source for premature death among young people. They included the daughter of the boxer Joe Louis, who was a classmate of mine, and they included the younger brother of my brother's best friend, who was killed in Los Angeles, I believe, when his mother was visiting, and he went to ask his neighbor to turn down the volume or whatever on their stereo or whatever the cause was, among several other people, as well. I had a cousin who chose to use a firearm in the case of suicide. So those are earlier things that made me aware of it. During my time here in Canada, I became involved politically on a couple of things and ended up working with a conservative group during the period of time that the government was in putting in place their version of background checks and firearm registration and the rest of it, which they have since taken away, and was quite surprised by the aggressiveness of the pro-firearm argument at that time, and the concerns that were expressed at that time that didn't entirely agree with them, and ended up in a number of conversations on that topic. More recently, of course, the events in Sandy Hook are emotionally touching, and they sort of reignited all those previous feelings. But my approach to this is much more balanced and moderate than I think the majority of pro-gun people think the people looking for some form of firearm control are looking at. Over to you, Joseph.
Thanks, Peter. I'm a native Midwesterner myself. I was born and raised in Ohio. I spent 21 years in military service and retired and moved to Indianapolis, and that's how I ended up here. One of the reason I'm so passionate about gun control is I believe that an armed populace is first of all a check on government power, overreaching government power. I think that's something that's fundamental to the American ideal and our form of government, as well as the ability to protect ourselves. I think violence in American society is a cultural issue more than it is a gun-caused issue. I think it's an issue caused by people, the culture and our society, more than it is more than it is the guns themselves. The gun itself is just it's a tool. It's morally neutral. So.
Okay, if I can pick up on a couple of things that you've said there, Joseph, I think we can probably find some common ground where we can have a fairly interesting discussion. First off, I think you need to understand that I'm not vociferous on the idea of let's get rid of these guns and let's change the Second Amendment and let's change the structure of society and all of those kinds of things. I think you and I are probably a lot closer to agreement with respect to some of the points you've made, just based on the comments you've made. My first question back to you is just quickly. You'd mentioned that the military for 21 years. Any particular branch or where?
Yeah, I was in the Army.
You were in the Army? Okay.
Yeah.
So just touching on the question. Because I come from a background where the judicial system was used as the check for government. So when a particular state made a law that was in one form or another unconstitutional, the employment of the judicial system and taking things up to the Supreme Court was part of the process. So I have a fairly firm and comfortable grasp on how that side of our democracy works. It happens just from my background that I'm acquainted with 3 U.S. Attorney Generals as a matter of life experience. They were people who came over for dinner kind of thing once in a while with my parents. So I have some insight into the workings on that side of the equation. So when you've served in the military, I mean, obviously you have a perspective that I don't have. I did not serve in the military at any point. And do you believe in your experience from the military that the government can, in this structure that we have, turn against its own people? I mean, I recognize it's a threat, but is it a reality?
I mean, yes, I think so. I at the danger of spinning off to another conversation, I just see a lot of government overreach. The government is involved in a lot of issues beyond its competence, beyond what the Constitution intended for it to be involved in.
Okay, so
if you run through the Bill of Rights, I mean, you look at First Amendment issues and the Health and Human Services mandate as part of the Affordable Care Act that makes religious institutions, for example, pay for medical procedures they find morally repugnant. You look at the indefinite detention provisions of the National Defense Authorization Act that allows the president simply on his decision, without due process, to detain American citizens who are suspected of being in cahoots with enemy combatants indefinitely for the duration of hostilities. I mean, that runs counter to the Fifth Amendment. And
understood, but again,
right?
not to justify the actions, but certainly during the earlier days of the Second World War, there was the Japanese internment.
Absolutely.
Other countries have done similar in periods of what they believe national threat. I mean, there's been some restitution in the aftermath of that. I'm not saying it was a correct or equitable thing by any stretch of the imagination. But when you mention the First Amendment and you mention the Health Care Act, my understanding of the Health Care Act is that they made allowances with respect to the elements of religious belief not having to pay, that the structure was created in such a way that was not the case, particularly on the topic of abortion and contraception. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of misinformation being pumped into the system to confuse people about what the real issues are. Whether I'm correct or not, with respect to the First Amendment, looking at the Second Amendment, there are limitations that exist. You can't, with the First Amendment, you can't jump up in a crowded theater and yell fire, and you can't libel somebody and various other things. You can libel them, but you can be held accountable for it. The separation of church and state, various other elements within that exist. And so as it is probably closer to being an absolute in the American Bill of Rights in terms of our rights than any of the other rights we have, because it is our way of addressing issues. I found the comments by Benjamin Wheeler's father in front of the Connecticut group that was looking at issues most telling. I don't know if you happen to see that, but he made a fairly interesting point on Jefferson's writing of the Declaration of Independence, in that he felt that the sequence of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the language was, to some degree, the sequence with which Jefferson viewed those inalienable rights. And one of the issues that we seem to struggle over is, where is the balance between one right and the next? Because certainly the right of life is what's at the center of the gun violence. Your comments earlier about crime are, I think, quite astute in that the problem is more social than physical. Although I would propose to you that there is a proliferation of guns that can be dealt with that have no impact on the firearms that belong to people that are using the firearms as tools, people that are using the firearms for self-defense of their home, people that are using the firearms for sport. I don't believe those firearms need any imposition beyond some form of registration and just so that somebody within, and I understand the concern if you have the government concern, but in a larger term, everything else we do in our life, somebody knows what we're up to. Every dollar you make is recorded by your income and retirement. Your car is recorded. Your auto insurance and home insurance pretty much has an itinerary of everything you own. So it is interesting. Is a threat to either one of us, but that someone in our larger demographic can pose a threat to either of us by the existence of that takes precedence over other ways in which we can protect ourselves. Right? If I'll let you tone in here because I don't want to dominate the conversation.
Sure. Well, I absolutely agree with you that our rights outlined in the Declaration are hierarchical. I mean, they run in order. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in that order. And that's fundamental to understanding both the Declaration and, reading the Constitution using the Declaration as a lens to clarify the meaning of the Constitution. So we're in agreement that we would be in agreement that the Second Amendment and perhaps even the First Amendment fall within the context of liberty. Would that life? Yes.
If we're hierarchical. Okay. So sure. we're because in the previous conversation I had on this topic with another proponent, I think first of all is the decision of the Supreme Court in 2008 with D.C. versus Heller that established the self-defense of the home. The only issue that sort of comes up from that is that was a change in the legal precedents that had existed previously. That, however, now that it has been made, is a reasoned decision and is the law and is accepted. There are those, of course, on the gun control side of the issue that would like to repeal the Second Amendment. They're not unlike the people on the right who would like to repeal Roe versus Wade. The fact of the matter is, it's an acceptable premise, and there's enough precedence around the concepts of self-defense, certainly with respect to the home, that there's no question there. So one of the arguments that I encounter quite frequently on the internet side of things is the idea that this desire to take away people's guns. I don't believe that exists. I mean, I understand that they can legislate whatever they want, but I don't believe that the intention is to take something away as much as it is to limit future access to. And with your background in the military, you would certainly have a better perspective on that element of weaponry that may or may not be threatening in a civil or retail sense. I mean, there's obviously weapons that you encountered in the military that I'm sure you don't want to see in your neighbor's house. And I think the perspective is more the physical attributes in terms of appearance with respect to what they're referred to as assault weapons than anything else. I don't have a big issue over the rifles. They will either be regulated in some time or not. I'm not concerned about that. I'm more interested in the ways in which we can sensibly curb the flow of illegal guns interstate and such. I mean, Chicago is certainly an interesting example of that particular problem. And the proliferation of suicide with firearms. I mean, of the 31,000 and some people that died in 2011, 20,000 of them were suicide. The majority of those took place with a rifle or a shotgun that were stored in the home, mostly in states. Wyoming, for example, I think is the state with the highest per capita suicide, which Chicago has its 500 murders. New Orleans, from statistics I've looked at, has a ratio or rate of murders that make it second to Honduras if it were a country. And it just happens to be the circumstances. I think those are post-Katrina numbers. New York has got very strict regulations, but Chicago is confiscating 6 times the number of firearms that New York is. I think your comment about the social side of it is where the solution lies, both for the suicide and for the crime. But there needs to be something done with the tap with respect to illegal firearms. I'm wondering what ideas flow on your side of the argument.
Well, I think enforcement of existing laws is a good place to start. We look at suicide, and is that more of I think that's more of a mental health issue than it is a gun control issue. I mean, I could walk to my medicine cabinet now and easily overdose on pills. I mean, if somebody wants to kill themselves, they're going to kill themselves. Access to a gun isn't going to stop them.
But it makes it more
probably
efficient,
more convenient. Pardon me?
Yeah, that's really the key issue. It's more convenient because apparently, according to the statistics, and the statistics I saw were in an article speaking to the issue that mentioned Wyoming. I can, we can connect after, and I can send you a copy of the article just for your information. But that non-firearm attempts at suicide, a person can have up to 10 attempts, apparently. And so the medicine cabinet, and only 1 in 10 is actually fatal, is the statistics, whereas firearm suicides, 99% are fatal. And apparently there's a window of about an hour between the decision and the execution of a suicide, according to this particular article. If that is indeed true, then the question becomes how do we address that issue itself? I agree with you that there's a certain portion of that which is a mental health issue. There's a certain portion of it which apparently appears to be an anger management issue, because a number of the suicides take place in the domestic murder-suicide scenario. Alcohol apparently plays a large role. So you have alcohol, domestic violence, perhaps other misdemeanor offenses that suggest a personality disorder that could lead to that type of problem solving. So I think it's more than there's a higher risk apparently if a home has firearms in it and they are accessible. The particular article I referenced before was a Wyoming family that the son committed suicide with the grandfather's trophy rifle that they had as a collector's item. And obviously, and the same sort of thing with as you say, it's convenience. And I'm of the view that if you can I understand the point about existing laws. I believe that the attempt to get universal background checks will have an impact with at least the gun traffic into cities like Chicago. My understanding is that about 32% of the firearms in Chicago come from other gun dealers within the state of Illinois, and the remaining 68% come from gun dealers as far afield as Mississippi. I think 10% of weapons in Chicago actually come from Mississippi. And that the calculation is that it really is only 1% of the gun dealers that are supplying all of the illegal arms flowing into Chicago. So it's really a case not so much of interfering other than inconveniencing you as an owner of firearms, as much as it is finding and disrupting the activities of that 1% of the gun dealers that are in fact making a huge profit from furnishing the illegal market through straw buyers and so on and so forth.
Well, that's an issue, and that's a loophole, or not a loophole, but I mean there are laws in place, to prevent that kind of thing. But see, universal registration of guns means the government has access to universal location. Now, I'm not saying that I'm not ultra paranoid that the government's going to come and claim my guns, but the only people who are going to obey a universal registration law are law-abiding citizens. Criminals are going to still have illegal firearms. They're going to have firearms that nobody knows about, And the thing is that you're going to force people who don't want universal registration of firearms and don't want the government knowing that what kind and how many guns they have are going to become lawbreakers. You're going to force people because of their principles to violate the law.
Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. It kind of falls into let's move it away from guns for a moment because it falls into the category of smoking, right? It's a personal choice. It has social costs, healthcare costs certainly associated with it that the rest of us bear in various ways. It has the impact on your neighbors or people sitting adjoining to you in a public place, those kinds of things. And yet, there's no requirement that you have to register in order to buy a pack of cigarettes or a cigar, but there are restrictions placed on that which the law-abiding various people on the argument that, well, if you say I can't smoke here, I'm still going to smoke there, so I'm a law-abiding citizen who chooses to violate the law. The premise of the law is that it is choice that determines the line. And if the line moves, there can be laws that neither one of us like, and if the line moves, for example, there might be a road in Indianapolis. I know there's a road here where I live where, for whatever reason, the city has chosen for that 2-block area to reduce the speed limit with no apparent, there's no school, there's no apparent justification for a street that runs from one end of the city to the other to reduce the speed limit so much. They probably use it as a way of generating income for the traffic department, because I've certainly been ticketed there more than once, having forgotten that they've done it. So but I don't intentionally go and say, oh, in this particular section, I'm going to drive that. I'm not going to make a conscious choice. I've been caught because I missed the sign. I'm taking it in a kind of silly direction, but the point is more one of, I look at firearms as tools. I accept the concept that they're tools. I understand that they're weapons, but I accept the principle that they're tools and defensive weapons. From a military perspective, I think you would understand that as well. That there are weapons that exist that are offensive, and there are weapons that exist that are defensive. They're designed for different purposes. So I look at firearms with respect to them. So they're tools in a rural setting for control of varmints and hunting, and for those people that are in urban settings that enjoy hunting, and for marksmanship and target shooting and range shooting, clay pigeons, all of those kinds of activities, they're basically tools. And whatever the caliber or velocity of a particular firearm, it just needs to be fitted to its particular requirements. You don't need an elephant gun to shoot rabbits. You need an elephant gun to shoot elephants. So if you're hunting elephants, by all means, have an elephant gun. And likewise, the various things. But there's a point within the use and the choice of use of a firearm where it crosses a line from being a tool to being a weapon, and not the line of self-defense of the home. That's a given. But it's when it goes outside of the home, and it goes from being a tool to being a weapon. And it's that point, in my view, that it's quite legitimate for the government to regulate. So the decision of an individual to buy or steal an illegal weapon, because the fact of the matter is that from my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, but less than 20% of the illegal weapons come from theft. So 80% of the illegal weapons are coming through the legal system. Somebody in the system is making a choice to provide it illegally, and that needs to be addressed. And go ahead.
Well, Max or Peter, my primary weapon, the gun I use the most or carry the most, is a Glock, and I paid in the neighborhood of $530 for it. A Glock 21. I don't know if that means anything to you, but in any event, I paid in the neighborhood of $500. Yeah, I paid in the neighborhood of $500 for it. It's a handgun. I could walk to a street corner in Indianapolis and probably buy that gun on the street for $200. Once it enters the illegal market, the price drops dramatically. That's part of the problem there. And I think that limiting the sales of weapons or imposing obstacles to legally buying weapons isn't going to stop that. I mean, and you use the analogy to smoking. Well, the problem with smoking is, comparing guns to smoking is that my right to smoke is not. I do smoke. You saw that, but my right to smoke isn't constitutionally guaranteed. My liberties aren't dependent on my ability to procure a pack of cigarettes. My liberties are dependent on my ability to have a firearm. I mean, again, I go back to the basic purpose of the Second Amendment, and it's to resist government oppression. So the weapons I own have to be equivalent to what the government has. When the government is the only one who has weapons, I mean, they talked the Sioux into giving up their weapons, and that resulted in the largest mass killing of all time at Wounded Knee, when over 200 unarmed Indians were killed because they turned their weapons in and didn't have the ability to resist the army. So the biggest perpetrator of mass killing in the United States history is the United States government.
The incident at Wounded Knee is as much a result of the actions of decisions made on the basis of racism as it is anything else. I mean, that was a case of the commanders on the ground making a decision and taking action. I mean, there's definite flaws in the history of the country with respect to a variety of different events. I mean, during the Civil War, what happened to the black regiments that were prisoners and so on and so forth. Some execution by the Confederates of any black prisoners that were in Union uniforms and things like that. So I mean, and we have on the one side of our history, we have this very noble history, and on the other side, we have this very dark page. And I'm completely sympathetic to. I'm completely sympathetic to arguments that try to limit that dark page in the future, and I respect that. I look at it and I go, okay, I fully appreciate that you as an individual are very capable and competent to own and if you will, operate a firearm. You're reliable. Society can trust that you're not going to go to a street corner in Indianapolis and take the Glock out and shoot everybody. And you're not likely to go to that street corner and buy the $250 Glock. I find that an interesting concept because there's got to be, I mean, for any criminal activity, there's got to be a profit motive, right? Because the whole premise behind crime is that you make more money doing it illegally than you do legally. So, I mean, one of the principles I know from real estate, which is an area that I do work in. Here in Canada, they have something called FinTrack, which is a financial tracking of activities. And once somebody shows up to a real estate transaction with more than a certain amount in cash, it triggers. Everybody has to report it, right? We are required to, upon meeting a prospective client, lawyers, real estate agents, banks, various other financial institutions, and people that are dealing with large amounts of money, are required to view a person's driver's license and identify that we are indeed dealing with that individual and not somebody else. And one of the reasons that they've done this is that mortgage fraud, one of the very effective ways. I mean, real estate, for example, is a very effective way of laundering money. So one of the very effective ways in which that's been achieved is by using the straw buyer concept, hiring somebody or convincing somebody to be the name on title. And the FinTrack has been one of the methods that's been used to limit or at least scare away individuals that might choose to do that. And I think that's part of the principle behind the universal background check, is it's to throw a wider net out and in effect force those fish to swim in a different part of the pond. And in doing so, you restrict the flow that presently is coming from one avenue of the gun supply. You restrict it more by eliminating a number of the middlemen that are profiting at present that would not profit under that kind of system. And then you end up with the dealers that are on the street corner, and you can address those through the existing laws and law enforcement and confiscation in various different ways. Nobody is naive enough to believe that we're going to drop from 31,000 and some deaths a year that relate to firearms to zero. That's naive and silly. But if we can reduce that by 10 or 15 or 20 or 50%, that's a considerable change. The U.S. leads the world in suicides. We're fairly well placed with respect to homicide. So homicide is not as much of an issue. The probability of an armed robbery taking place at your home is far less than the majority of people believe. Certainly a burglary is not. I mean, there's certainly reasons to have and protect your home. But the incidence of crime, we're not in a state of anarchy. I mean, I know that one of the arguments that was put forth by the NRA in the congressional setting was the idea that another Katrina event would create a reasonable basis for which to have firearms. To a degree, I don't disagree with that. I mean, obviously, you're already armed. You're protected. To what extent one would be. I mean, I've had the experience of being in a severe snowstorm. I lived in Buffalo in '76 when it was hit so hard with snow. And I found in that experience, which was a disaster, it wasn't Sandy or Katrina, but it was a disaster, was the community more bound together than people taking advantage of everybody else's inability to look after themselves. So the social dynamic was different. Now I know that the circumstances could be much different in a situation where everything's been destroyed. But generally speaking, in those circumstances, in my experience, been through a few good windstorms and tornado experiences, the communities tend to bind together, and the criminal element, although it does exist and is a threat, we haven't succumbed to the anarchy that existed in Yugoslavia, for example, when they had their internal wars. Not yet. And I don't know if we risk that or not. That's a judgment call for you to make with your background and experience. I've left you speechless.
I just, my concern is the whole idea behind the Second Amendment and not infringing the right to bear arms, again, is the people acting as a foil to the armed force of the government. And we need to have that right. We need to have weapons that are roughly equivalent to what the government could employ against us, potentially. Now, I'm not saying that tomorrow civil war is going to break out.
That's not unreasonable. That's not unreasonable in respect to the concept of a law-abiding citizen with a firearm. But turn that on its head. That same weapon is available to the elements that want to disrupt the government then. And you've served in the military. Is that something that is that something that in your capacity at that time you would have been comfortable confronting? I'm not, overwhelming force and the rest of it. You've got tactics and various things, but from the flip side, not because the law-abiding citizen isn't a threat to the government any more than the stable government is a threat to this law-abiding citizen. We're talking about anarchy in the extreme, right? And I just throwing that out there because what's good for the goose is good for the gander when you put it out and say that, for example, you could own RPG because that would be a comparable weapon. And that's where I go back to the tool crossing to weapon point as to where the government has the authority to legislate. Because if I look at the First Amendment, there are restrictions on my freedom of speech.
Sure.
I can, if I choose to, I can produce all the pornography I want, for example. But if I start producing child pornography or using underage performers to produce whatever, I'm violating a moral ethic, and I'm certainly violating something, and I lose my First Amendment right. So I find it an interesting concept that one right would have exclusivity over all other rights, because our right against unfair search and seizure, which is also within the Constitution, which protect you from the confiscation of guns, unlawful seizure, is not brought up in the conversation. Equal treatment under the law, all the issues surrounding voting, we need to find a balance. And I think the discussion, we're not going to stop Sandy Hooks, right? We're not going to stop that. We may be able to reduce the frequency, which is part of the objective, because the frequency has increased from what it was in the past. And that ought to be an issue of concern, because you and I can have children or grandchildren in that setting, and neither one of us would want to experience that. What happened to the young girl that was performing at Obama's inaugural is an unfortunate sequence of events. We may be able to decrease the frequency of those events by reducing the number of available firearms. We may be able to decrease the frequency of events. I mean, in recent weeks, a 3-year-old died in Kentucky, I believe it was, because he mistook his mother's pink firearm, handgun, for a toy. Right?
Yeah.
Why do we need a designer gun? I mean, just as a
it's a
common sense needs to play a little bit.
I'd never buy a pink gun myself.
No, neither. I mean, a pink Glock is probably not.
When it comes to the idea that we're going to stop illegal trade by regulating the gun industry or regulating who can buy what weapon or by registering weapons, I mean, that doesn't work. I mean, we control who can legally possess certain narcotics, but we still have a huge drug abuse problem in this country. I mean, we've made meth. Meth is illegal. I can't go to the store and buy over a certain amount of cold medication because of methamphetamine producers. But, despite all of our efforts there, you can still go out and buy methamphetamine. You can still go out and buy heroin. It doesn't work.
But certainly you would agree, certainly the pharmaceutical industry and the supply of drugs is very regulated. The government knows, I would think, within reasonable numbers where the supplies of X, Y, and Z might be sitting within the pharmaceutical trade. There's fairly stiff documentation required. In the case of Michael Jackson's death, there's a certain amount of scrutiny that comes against the physicians that are prescribing the various drugs. There's kind of cause and effect and recourse. And certainly one of the suggestions that I saw that struck me as an interesting concept, because there's a whole series of different things here. I understand from the perspective of I as an individual own whatever, and it's really nobody's business what I own unless I choose to disclose that to them. I appreciate that point. I don't know that I necessarily agree with it 100% with guns, but I'll for the moment, let's accept it as a principle. But in the event that we're dealing with pharmaceuticals, I just need to find my thought again here. We're dealing with pharmaceuticals, we're dealing with regulations, we're dealing with registrations, and all of these various different things. Okay, when something goes wrong with a particular drug, whatever it might be, there exists within the structure, the CDC has the ability, the pharmaceutical organizations have the facilities to do various studies and research. One of the severe problems that exists at the moment is that we lack the ability to track anything with any consistency. One of the suggestions that came up that I found very, very interesting as a concept was the idea of requiring every gun manufacturer to capture the markings of the discharge of the particular weapon on a cartridge, on a bullet, and have a national database where that image is associated with a serial number, and to be able to track the history of a weapon, in effect, fingerprinting the gun, and to have that as a resource in a database. And we certainly have the technology now with computers and the databases that exist. And we certainly have the technology, and I appreciate the concern. If you own 15 guns and you only tell the government you have 5, and they somehow figure out that you have 15, then you're in a different kettle of fish. And I appreciate. I don't agree with, because I'm not worried about the government in this, because I see the government working, right? If you're unhappy with what's happening with the government today, in 2 years there's an opportunity to put different elected officials on one level in play, and in 2 more years there's an opportunity to put other elected officials in play, and the ebb and flow of that goes goes on, and that's part of our structure. I think one of our great strengths is the peaceful transition of power. So I tend to be more optimistic than pessimistic about the government. I recognize the risks and the concerns, but I tend to be more optimistic about them. Bully for me. But excuse me, I do see that there is an opportunity to find a balance, and it really comes down to a balance. One suggestion was just renewable licenses. So you need to have the authority to purchase. I mean, when I went through this experience a number of years ago in Canada, I had to have two different levels of license. One that I was qualified to handle the weapons I was handling, and another to be actually able to procure them. And so that may be a way of checking and balancing against impaired driving, being an indication of alcohol abuse, because alcohol certainly plays a large role, and so does substance abuse in a number of the homicides and certainly in the suicides. And you know, perhaps it is not so much the guns as it is the related information, but data seems to play a huge part, and data has been impinged upon by various riders put against existing laws that impede the ability of the FBI and the CDC and other research elements from studying cause and effect. You know, again, I go and I find it untenable that somebody can say, well, yeah, we can make pink guns, we can make guns that look like Hello Kitty toys, and not have a problem with that. That to me is that's the child pornography side of firearms, as far as I'm concerned. Why make something attractive that's lethal to children? You know, why make it attractive to children and have it be lethal to children? That I don't get, but that's one issue. As I said earlier, I'm not as caught up on the testosterone side of things, and guns that firearms that look like what you might have used in the military being a risk. They're no more or less a risk than anything else. But I go back to if you're hunting rabbits, you don't need an elephant gun. And so perhaps there's a gradation similar to pilots, let's say. Maybe that's a way to approach this. You, with your experience, probably have sufficient experience to deal with a wide range, capable and competently deal with a wide range of munitions. I, on the other hand, with my limited experience, maybe I'm not qualified to handle anything that can fire beyond a certain distance. There was a recent event in, I think it was in Arizona, it might have been another western state, where two fellows were arrested for target shooting because they were firing off in their backyard, and it was going through 3 or 4 houses, and it blew up somebody's microwave in their kitchen, you know, half a block away. There's responsible and irresponsible firearm use. There's common sense, and there's misuse. And what I'm concerned about is the misuse of use and the illegal use and the illegal trafficking. And I believe that anything that turns off a tap in the illegal traffic will reduce the numbers of firearms that are available, and in doing so will reduce, maybe only minor, but will reduce the possibility, say, of, you know, a 15-year-old who performs at the president's inaugural being shot by mistake in a casual drive-by scenario, or those events. Those events are hard to track, but certainly the proliferation of illegal weapons, the proliferation of firearms in the homes, because only, in my understanding, is, what is it? It's about 40% or less of U.S. homes are retaining the firearms, and yet we have 75% of the world's private firearms, small arms, I guess is the word to use. You know, there's 870 or 800. Yeah, I believe the number is 870 million firearms in the world, small arms that are considered in in private hands. 75% are held in the U.S. or something to that effect. It's a significant number, and we end up with one firearm per person, per soul, but only being held by 40% of the households, which is about 100 million homes.
Well, and I think it's always been that way. I think, that firearms are part of the American culture. And that stems from, the way our military was originally supposed to be set up was supposed to be a militia system, a lot like Switzerland. And we've opted for a standing army so that we can project power around the world. Now, that's another discussion. But part of the reason that makes the United States what it is, I think, is that firearm culture and that militia culture. I mean, it's written into federal law, and it's contained in a lot of state constitutions that, the militia actually consists of everybody over, for example, in Indiana, it's everybody over 17 years of age, So we're expected to operate as a state militia when necessary. And the state constitution guarantees us that right as well, that we're allowed to own firearms specifically for the defense of ourselves in the state of Indiana. So,
right, but that's a decision by the state to call out the militia. That's not a decision by Joe Blow to call himself a militia. I mean, that's one of the issues that come up in this. I mean, the well-regulated militia is still, in effect, a government body. It may be a local government body, but it's a government body, and it can, under the structure of the Constitution, it falls under the federal jurisdiction up to a point. And I understand that the point about the standing army that became part of the issue in the earlier era, and one of the reasons we ended up with the standing army was that they found the militia structure, again going back to the Indians in Ohio, in fact. In the early days, that the militia performed very poorly, and one of the great defeats. And I'm afraid I can't remember the specifics on it, but I was just reading about it a week or two ago because I happened to be reading a book about 1780 to 1816. Oxford University has a very good series of books on U.S. history, and I happen to be in that one. The militia performed quite poorly. There was a massacre of that particular militia by the Indians, and there was some standing army involved as well. But it was the combination of standing army and militia that ultimately resolved that particular conflict. It wasn't a large standing army at the time. I mean, most of the military expenditure in the earlier days of the Civil War was into the Navy, and certainly, I mean, just to address the certainly one of the arguments I've heard from somebody is the sort of Red Dawn scenario of having the firearms to protect ourselves from some outside invasion. We have the Atlantic and the Pacific and the world's largest navy by 10 or 15 times. I don't think we need to worry about somebody coming across the borders in that sense. So that argument is moot. The other principle, I mean, you're absolutely correct that the Second Amendment was created to guarantee the presence of militias. There was the Militia Act. There's very specific regulation at the time. Again, in its earlier stages, it was a racial issue. Like everything else, you had to be a white male of a certain age and a property owner or whatever to fall within the confines of that. And that's certainly part of the existing structure. And it was certainly in the earlier time a necessary component, but this was a wild environment. The principle of it being in place in order to protect us from our government is an argument that Jefferson put forward at various times when he was dissatisfied with the Federalists and when he felt threatened that the Federalists were taking, I don't know why my camera's doing that, the Federalists were taking the country back to a monarchy. when in fact Hamilton was simply setting up the combination of Hamilton and Jefferson has basically given us both the arguments and the structure that we have today in terms of government. So it's a fairly interesting scenario. But again, there is a point in this discussion where you go, too many people, and I think you would agree with me. I mean, since the time that John F. Kennedy was assassinated, numerically, more Americans have died through a firearm-related incident than have died in all of the wars that America has been involved in from its conception. The Revolutionary War right up to Afghanistan. And it's a significant number of people. It's still, percentage-wise, it's a small number, but it's a significant number of people. It's over 1 million people. And that's within your and my lifetime. And I'm certain, I'd have to sit down and write up a list, but I know a lot of people who have perished as a result of a firearm. I probably know more people who died from firearms than I do from automobiles. And as much as cancer and heart attack are predominant causes, for whatever reason, I'm living several hundred miles to the U.S. border. I still know more people, perhaps because I'm from the south side of Chicago, but I still know more people who died as a result of violent events. And I'm struck by if I can go and eat oatmeal and reduce my cholesterol, and it's not going to stop me from having a heart attack, but it is going to reduce my cholesterol, and I might get another couple hours or a couple of years out of doing that. That's common sense. If I can come up with reasoned understandings between myself and other people, and we can get our administrators and legislators to act on them, can we not come up with some solutions for issues like pink guns and $250 firearms on the street corner? I mean, again, going to another incident, there was a young boy killed in January. Some would say deservedly so, but he and his buddy had gone and bought a shotgun off the street and were playing with it, and that was the end of it. They were young black kids in whatever community they were in. And it's a senseless loss of life. And economically, the cost of policing, the cost of hospitalization, all of the associated costs with the death toll, and the majority of our victims in this, both suicide and homicide, are people under 27. So we're killing off our youth in respect. The other high area in suicide is men your and my age, and predominantly white. Oddly enough, but that has to do with depression. It has to do with health. It has to do with a number of things. Yeah. And there are a number of I look forward to having a conversation with you where we talk about education and societal solutions, because I think that's where the solutions lay.
I think so too. I think that's where the biggest part of the solution lay. I think we need to look into mental health issues. We need to look into teaching people how to identify and intervene in those situations that are going to lead to suicide. We need to teach people that you have to be a responsible gun owner. If somebody in your house is suffering from depression or some other mental illness, then you have to realize that it's incumbent on you not to have that person have access to firearms, whether you lock them up or empty your house of firearms. Again, if you have kids, you have to secure your firearms. You have to make sure you've got trigger locks for them, that you've got them locked up in a safe and out of reach of the kids, and not laying on top of the nightstand.
So those are common sense. Those are common sense solutions. But then why have an issue if those solutions become regulations? For example, if you have children in the house, you have to have a certain type of security. Or are you comfortable with those as possible solutions?
I think common sense is common sense. I mean, I live in the inner city. Nobody has to tell me not to go out in the backyard and set up a shooting range. That's just something I don't do.
Right. No, and I understand.
We can't legislate common sense.
I think it goes down to, quite frankly, Joseph. I think it goes down to earlier in our conversation we identified, or our understanding, my understanding, not necessarily your understanding, my understanding is that 1% of gun dealers represent a disproportionate share of the flow of illegal firearms, well over 50%. Okay, that's my understanding. So it's however many firearm dealers we have a certain percentage that are misbehaving. I suspect, likewise, amongst people who have a respect for firearms, a very small percentage are those that, because again, the numbers probably do support that. A very small percentage are those that misuse a gun at the inappropriate moment in an argument or in a moment of depression and various things. And I think you're absolutely right. You and the vast majority of responsible firearm owners are not going to step into their backyard and fire off their gun and set up their own firearm range. But somebody amongst the group is doing that. I mean, one of the very first people to die this year was a 10-year-old girl in Pennsylvania who was standing on the front porch of her aunt's house to watch the fireworks, and a minute after midnight she was struck by a bullet that somebody had shot off in the air, however far away from her home that person was. That is...
And that person violated an existing law.
No,
I mean,
I fully
saved the girl's life.
No, and I'm not blaming that on responsible firearm owners, but I'm going, what is it in our culture that gives that individual? I mean, the governor of Texas, there's photographs of him doing the exact same thing, firing a gun into the air. Now, I'm assuming he used blanks, but nobody knows. It's Texas. Right? There's a photograph, but there's pictures of Rick Perry shooting him off a gun with a deputy standing right next to him. And that's, part of the issue is that it is part of our culture, and it's a part of our culture we need to I mean, if that was your or my granddaughter, we'd be devastated.
Absolutely.
It's a senseless death.
It is tragic. It is senseless. I agree. And that person violated, the person who discharged that firearm violated a law. It's like Adam Lanza and Sandy Hook. Before he even got to the school, he violated 15 laws. It didn't stop him from killing those people.
But that takes me back to the one suggestion that was made that strikes me as a sensible suggestion, is having some central database of if you will, the firearm fingerprint. Because if the ballistic markings of that particular bullet could be traced, then that individual could be found and perhaps prosecuted. But, without any data, you can't do that. And that's so do we allow all this senseless killing and all this illegal killing and a great number of tragic domestic situations that result in suicide or murder-suicide to continue, or do we start addressing those elements of illness in our society through a variety of things, education and social programs and all of those things, but also with respect to the very vehicle, if you will, of the event. In terms of, if it turns out that and it is the case that handguns are disproportionate in violent homicide, that they think they represent something in the neighborhood of 68% of the homicides or more, then does it not make some sense to find ways in which to curb the flow of illegal firearms? And what are those ways, if not through closing some of the loopholes that people access them? I mean, of course, they're going to continue to access them, but if you reduce the number from 100 guns to 98 guns, then you know, I mean, obviously there's a cost balance that needs to take place too. But to say something doesn't work because you're not getting 100% is facile, as much as to say, well, if we only get 1%, it's worth spending all our money on. I mean, those are both
the number one choice weapon for physical assaults is a baseball bat. I mean, so are we going to start registering?
That's not true. No, that's not true. I don't know where you get that fact, but that's not true. Bludgeoning represents, in homicide, bludgeoning represents the same level as rifles and shotguns. It's about 6%.
No, I'm not saying killing. I'm saying assault.
But and assault, I'd have to look at the FBI stats, but I don't believe that that's true. We'll have to. Well, the next time we'll talk, I'll look that up. The FBI keeps fairly accurate in their crime stats, and I've certainly looked at. I didn't look in beyond other than I was looking at firearms specific, but firearms represent in aggravated assault. Firearms represent again 43% of the weapons used. So I would imagine the rest are split between a variety of things. Fists have their own thing. Bludgeoning would be hammers and baseball bats. And I mean, I find that I've had that argument with respect to the homicides thrown at me, and you know, if we talk, you know, people say, well, let's regulate hammers on that basis. You know, there are a lot of different things you can hit somebody over the head with, and so bludgeoning as a statistical group within the fatalities represents roughly the same percentage as rifles and shotguns do. Handguns, by far and away, are the leading cause of fatalities among homicides. But guns in general are less than 70%. I think it's 68.5 or 7% of homicides in 2011 or 12 were firearm related, and that number hasn't changed dramatically over the course of a number of years. And homicides indeed are down, and crime on many levels have gone down. There's a variety of reasons for that, and one of them being that the baby boom is well past its criminal prime. But you're starting to see the signs of the echo. Our peak in homicides was in the early 90s, apparently. Again, though, it comes down to it's not an attack on, in my view, it's not an attack on a specific firearm or class of firearms or any of those elements. It's a question of finding, through various different mechanisms, ways in which to reduce the senseless fatalities where certainly anger management would help perhaps in resolving a number of these things. A disproportionate number of homicides and injuries take place in situations over arguments over money. It does, you know, the assumption that it's gang and gang related is not upheld by statistics. Yes, there are gang killings, and yes, there are gang related killings, and yes, there are juvenile gang killings, and they represent significant numbers. But arguments between two people that happen to know each other, that have a relationship of business or family, play a huge role in this. I mean, we have it's a South African issue, but we have that South African runner that you know has ended up being charged, I believe, with the homicide of his girlfriend.
Historians, the runner.
Yeah. I mean, it's just an example that it's not a problem that's specific only to the U.S., but it is an example that speaks to a level of social problem, right? And I'm from the school of let's find solutions to our social problems the best we can. We're not going to solve it 100%, but as best we can. I mean, every ghetto child that has an opportunity for employment, meaningful employment, and a stable future is one less potential gangbanger. As